I hope you're well. So a few weeks back I took a look at the Wolfcraft Master 1600 portable bench. You can watch the previous video if you want the full gory story, but my conclusion on it was that it was a well-made, well-priced bench with solid underpinnings, just let down by some weird design choices and not just this wackadoodle extrusion on the front and rear, but also the worktop surface as well. There'll be a full makeover to come on this, but leaving this extrusion out of the equation, there are 3 quick fixes that we can do that all revolve around the top, where the whole layout and the grid spacing severely limits the crosscut capacity, and the thickness of the top material makes clamping into a real chore. The obvious quick fix, of course, would just be to replace the top with the standard MFT top. But for now, I'm just going to use what I have, and I'll do what I can to make this, as it comes out of the box, much more usable. So first problem, clamps. Clamping onto an MFT top like this is one of the most common uses. Rail clamps are perfect for the job because they've got no head, so they fit directly through the holes. But it is known that any top thicker than 18 millimeters, and this one is 22 millimeters, anything thicker than that, while it might be good for stability and flatness and for durability over time, it's not so good for clamps, as the rail clamps just don't fit. This is a known issue. It's been a known issue ever since there have been MFT tops with 20 millimeter dog holes, 20 years or more. A top thicker than 18 millimeters is going to cause you problems with the clamps. Fortunately, because it's a known problem, there's a known answer. You just chamfer the holes on the underside, a very small bevel, and I've already done most of these. All I've got to do is this last column on the center. To do that, I need to get this bench onto the other bench next door. So the chamfer bit that I'm using is a perfectly standard bearing guided bit. It's one of those ones that came in a set. Nothing special about it. There's a couple of things you want to watch out for when you're using it. Be careful not to take too much off. The quad bench dogs in particular need both of those little rubber washers to be contained within the bore. So run a test first. You need to keep at least sort of 16 to 18 mil of thickness left. Run a quick test, make sure that there's enough space for those. And talking of space under the bench at the edges can be quite tight as well, especially when you're using a plunge router base. The fixed base is generally a little bit smaller, but I'd recommend letting the bits spin down between cuts if you are using a fixed base router. That's why I prefer to use a plunge base router, the same as I prefer to use a plunge saw. The bit is only exposed when it's actually doing the cutting. It's also quite a small circular motion, so do concentrate. It's easy to lose track on a repetitive task, and mistakes can happen then, and you do not want to be making mistakes when you've got a sharp, spinny thing in your hands at that time. Okay, that's the clamping sorted. Let's talk about crosscuts and rail hinges. So, the lack of an appropriate extrusion on the side of the bench means that the only commercial rail hinge that you'd be able to use is the Bench-Dog's quad MFT hinge. Nothing wrong with that. It's a lovely hinge. This is an early prototype. The actual shipping models are much prettier these days, but it is an MFT hinge, and it does expect a grid of holes on 96 millimeter centers. The Wolfcraft bench has a grid of holes on 128 millimeter centers, which means that you've got to jump through a few hoops to make it work. I haven't actually tried it. I am presuming it would work. You'd need to get the template into one of the holes and then square this off against the edge, and then use that to to bore your holes. To be perfectly honest, if you're spending the money on the Benchdogs quad MFT hinge, even with the 5% discount that you get using offer code 10-Minute Workshop at checkout for 5% discount across the board at benchdogs.co.uk, even doing that, I would probably factor in the other 40 or 50 quid it costs to replace the Wolfcraft top with a normal MFT top. Of course, not everybody has the means or the need for a rail hinge. What a lot of people use instead is a couple of tall Benchdogs, like the quad dogs, for example, placed into a column of holes like this, and then the guide rail bearing against them. Now, one benefit, perhaps the only benefit of the grid of holes on 128mm centres, is that when you do this, your cut line actually falls between a column of holes. With a standard MFT top, like this one, your cut line falls across a column of holes. And the way around that normally is to use a jig of some kind to offset the hole between the columns and that little bit further out. There's a few different ways you can do that. The 10-Minute Workshop MultiJig that is coming out soon has that facility. But of course, with the Wolfcraft bench, you need to stay in line with the column of holes, but to get them a little bit further out, because as they're set, you only get a crosscut of a maximum of 490mm. Now, you could just measure and mark this carefully, but if the whole point is to get a pair of extra holes that increases the crosscut, they've really got to be perfectly in line with a column so that they're absolutely square to the row. The whole point of this is to get precise, accurate cuts after all. Now, you can, of course, just use an MFT jig if you have one, to extend those holes out, because 96mm and 128mm are both on the 32mm system. They actually coincide periodically, and if you have an MFT jig, then you can use it to put extra holes further out. Of course, if you've got an MFT jig, then you might as well just make yourself a new top. This is the MFT, the 10-Minute Workshop MFT Plus jig, by the way, out later in the year. I know I've been saying that for a while, but it really is coming. I'm actually going to use something else to make these holes. I'm going to use the 10-Minute Workshop MultiJig, which will be out in a few weeks' time. So most MFT jigs would require you to have a 30mm Benchdag, and my MFT jig is no different to that. With the MultiJig though, we've got a couple of more economical options, let's say. Incidentally, I said before, all the Benchdags I have are a little bit loose in this Wolfcraft MFT top. A simple turn of thin masking tape around the body of the Benchdags seem to work just fine, so I'm going to be using that for all the standard non-quad Benchdags in future. So yeah, I mean, basically you've got a jig that requires a 30mm guard bush, and fairly obviously if you've got a 20mm Benchdag like the quad dog, or a standard 25mm head Benchdag, that's not going to fit very well. So what we need is some way to adapt those, and I've got just a simple little dog collar that goes around the 25mm dog, oops, and one that also goes around the 20mm quad dog, and that holds everything in place really nicely. I'm going to get a clamp on that. I'm going to bore a couple of holes out, one at the bottom here to extend this column, one at the top to extend it a little bit further, and then we'll do a couple across to act as a fence as well. And before you ask, this is a 20mm bit that I've had a precision engineer pal ground down to make a really nice snug fit. I'm trying to get these made in sufficient volume that I can offer them with the 10-Minute Workshop MFT Plus jig when it launches later in the year. As always, with both the 10-Minute Workshop MultiJig and the MFT Plus jig, you can register an interest at 10minutejigs.com, or I'll put a direct link down in the description below. So that's not actually looking too bad. We've got dogs in the top here for to act as a fence. You've got dogs, quad dogs for the guide rail there. You can also have one of the cut down bench dogs on the cut side if you need it. You actually get a over 600mm 620 crosscut, which is pretty good. That means that you could get, say, a sheet of board ripped in half and you can still fit it on your bench. All these act as a fence. That acts as your square crosscut. So yeah, pretty good, pretty happy with that. The only thing that's missing really is something that I put on all of my benches, and that's a sacrificial strip so that you can cut into it comfortably. So we'll get on with that next, and then I think we can call that one fairly complete. I'm using the track saw to start with just to give a cleaner shoulder to the cut, and I've added spacers against the dogs to push the strip out wider. And then I'm moving it back under the rail effectively for bevel cuts. You don't want to be falling off the sacrificial strip when you make a bevel cut, as I find out to my disadvantage. I'll finish this off with the router. MDF is soft, so I can make the 6mm cut in a single pass, just moving the straight edge, the back of the guide rail, across. Then back to the centre to complete the cut. Then I can just rip a strip of scrap 6mm MDF to fit. Slot it in and we're done. It's a pretty snug fit. If you need to, you can pop a little bit of double-sided tape under that sacrificial strip. But there you go, 3 quick fixes that make the Wolfcraft Master 1600 bench much more useful. Should you need to do that, do those to a bench of this kind of price? Absolutely not. But if you happen to have one already, or if it ticks all the other boxes for you otherwise, then these 3 easy wins are definitely worth doing and make it a much more useful bench. I'll call this one done for this week though. Thanks ever so much for taking a look. Thank you as always to the amazing 10-Minute Workshop Plus members. Come and join us, be part of the conversation that helps to form these public facing videos. And the 10-Minute Workshop, MFT Jig, or the MultiJig. If either of those two tickle your fancy, then be sure to register an interest at 10minutejigs.com or use the direct link in the video description down below, as there'll be limited quantities of those in the first run. I hope to have the MultiJig out in the next few weeks. But that's for another week. That's all for this week. Thanks for taking a look, and I'll see you all again very soon. All right, take care.